Joining me now is Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. So much I want to talk to you about, but I do want to start with the debt limit deal. And what we know so far is that the debt ceiling would be raised for 2 years, a 1% cap on non-defense spending for the 2025 to the 2025 fiscal year, a clawback of unspent COVID funds, increased work requirements, temporary for certain low-income adults on food stamps, a cut of some new funds that were going to the IRS. Is there anything more as you're learning details of the deal that you would add to that or you would correct of what I just said?
Well, I think it's important to note that we are still learning the details of this deal, and I'll reserve judgment until I've read it. But let's just be clear. I want to underscore something you said at the outset, which is that there's an enormous amount of damage that's already been done to the economy and to this country. I just came back from overseas, and every international newscast has been leading for the last week with stories of this Republican-imposed chaos in the United States. This Republican Party is addicted to chaos. The entire Trump presidency, January 6th, and now this threat to default and crater the American economy. This is terrible for the country, for our reputation abroad, for our ability to draw investment. I wasn't a fan of negotiating over the debt ceiling and over default, but President Biden sat down with confidence that he could work out a deal that didn't give in to the most draconian, most outrageous of the Republican demands. And from what I can see, Republicans didn't get any of the big things they were asking for. They didn't get massive long-term cuts to programs for the poor or the middle class. They didn't get the repeal of the president's signature renewable energy bill. They didn't get big new requirements pushing people out of the Medicaid program. So I'm going to take a look at what's on the table, but it's pretty clear that President Biden kept the most reckless things that Republicans were asking for out of this agreement.
Now, it seems easier to get through the Senate, or that's the rumor. You tell me if that's incorrect. But there are some senators, some of your colleagues like Mike Lee, who said he would delay it with every procedural tool at his disposal if the spending cuts didn't meet his satisfaction. That was before the deal came out, but there has been some rumblings. Are you and other Democrats prepared for some of that finagling on the Senate floor to delay this?
Well, you're really playing with fire. It's going to take at least 3 to 4 days for this to get through the House of Representatives. And then it could take as long as a week if Republicans use all of the procedural tactics at their disposal. That, of course, would result in a default on American debt. Yeah, something that we would never recover from. But listen, part of the reason that I was reluctant to get involved in these negotiations is that I think there's a whole big swath of the Republican Party that actually wants us to default. And you're already seeing the right wing
in the House or the Senate, too?
I think mostly in the House, but some in the Senate. But I think mostly in the House. And you're starting to see the Freedom Caucus already rallying the troops against this deal. My worry is that there may still not be enough Republicans in the House to get this deal done. So, yes, there are a lot more responsible voices in the Republican Party in the Senate, but it can't get to us if McCarthy can't deliver his caucus.
Yeah, how worried are you about there not being enough House votes? I mean, is that a real risk that we should be bracing ourselves for?
I think we should be worried about that. I hope that Kevin McCarthy knows his caucus, but he didn't show much evidence of that when he was counting his own votes for his speakership. So let's see. I think the president has done the best possible job he could here. It's now Speaker McCarthy's job to deliver the majority. He has the majority. They are in charge of governing, and now Speaker McCarthy has to show that he can actually lead his caucus to a result.
Could be a rocky road. I wanted to turn to the 2024 presidential race, and specifically foreign policy being discussed in that race. Ron DeSantis is the newest candidate to really struggle to answer the question about the U.S. commitment to Ukraine. He called the war a, quote, territorial dispute, which you know well is a Kremlin talking point, before scrambling to walk that back. And then, of course, Donald Trump couldn't articulate during a CNN town hall if he wanted Ukraine to win the war. And you just came back from an overseas trip. You spent a lot of time working on these issues. I just want people to understand how worried they should be if Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis is elected as it relates to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, listen, I don't begrudge anybody who opposes a war that the United States is involved in. That's not unpatriotic. But what's worrying is that, as you mentioned, it does seem to be some very specifically worded Russian talking points that find their way into the comments of Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump. This is not a territorial dispute, right? This is good versus evil. This is a country that is intentionally targeting civilians, that is essentially trying to disrupt the entire post-World War II order in which big countries don't invade small countries. This is a relatively cheap investment for the United States. The Ukrainians aren't asking for U.S. troops to fight this war. They're just asking for help to pay for their effort to make sure that we don't unleash big countries like Russia or China invading smaller countries. So to me, it's really worrying that you don't really know right now where Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or the entire Republican Party stands. I think the American people know that the fight for Ukraine matters, and I think Republican candidates are going to pay a price if they got all fuzzy on which side they're on.
Now, one of the things we don't talk about a lot is the role of Russia in intervening in the election as they did in 2016. Are they further incentivized, or is that something we should be talking about, thinking about? Are you concerned about that happening in 2024?
So they absolutely are going to get involved in this election. They are going to try to influence this election if they think that a Republican candidate will pull the United States out of the war. Because without the United States right now, Russia marches into Kyiv. I mean, that's just the reality. And so Russia wins the war if the United States withdraws its support. And now that they see signals from DeSantis and Trump that they're going to do Russia's bidding, I really think that that's a green light for the Russians to play a lot of the same games, maybe even more sophisticated, maybe even more overt games than they played in the 2016.
So they are watching the Republican primary and they are seeing what they say. Before I let you go, I did want to ask you about Saudi Arabia, because there has, of course, been a lot of interest from some of your Republican colleagues about President Biden and his family's finances. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is still very cozy with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and is hosting another live golf tournament at one of his properties. So as somebody who has served on the Foreign Relations Committee, what questions do you still have about Donald Trump and his family business and kind of these relationships?
I guess I don't have that many questions. I think we know exactly what's going on here. Donald Trump's relationship with the Saudis is all about making money for his family. You know, everybody sort of scratched their heads when the first trip he made as president of the United States was to Saudi Arabia, right, a brutal dictatorship in the middle of the Middle East. Well, it kind of makes sense now. You see, literally within months of Trump leaving office, his son-in-law cutting a deal with the Saudis. You now see Donald Trump directly profiting from the Saudi-led golf tournament. I think President Trump has now made it very clear that if you reelect him, he is simply going to use the White House as a means to enrich himself and his family. He's not hiding that at all. So not a lot of questions. You basically just have a lot of answers.
Senator Chris Murphy, I could ask you 100 more questions. Fellow Nutmegger, thank you for joining me here this Memorial Day weekend.